Lisa, and welcome everyone. We are incredibly excited to have Teresa join us today on a topic that is of incredible interest to many of you on the line, as well as our clients who are all struggling with the challenges of inclusion and diversity within their workplaces. So we're excited to bring you the best of what's going on in the industry as it relates to D&I, and have this as a robust dialogue. So just by way of background about the Leadership Development Group, as most of you know, we are a core team of 5 mighty leadership development executives that run what I like to say the ship of the Leadership Development Group. We have Tara Satlow, who's our VP of Client Solutions, who most of you know, Lisa Clark, who directs our coaching and operations, as well as Corey Long, our newest addition, who manages many of our projects and as well as our website and some of our more innovative solutions that we're developing. And Amy Reamer, who is managing our public relations and marketing. Our firm is built on developing leaders across the health ecosystem. So Teresa, if you could go to the next slide, terrific. We work with executives and physician leaders to develop them to execute their strategy within their organizations, their sectors, and across the health ecosystem. Through our work with health industry organizations, we've recognized that diversity and inclusion is a key priority that many of them are struggling with. And it is for that reason, as I mentioned earlier, that we're really excited to have Teresa join us. The only way really to transform any industry is to do so through diversity of thought and talent and experiences. So the idea around bringing in different types of leaders within an organization is one that is certainly aligned to our vision. So next slide, Teresa, thank you. In terms of your colleagues, you are joining us today as one of our 400 plus faculty that are a part of our team for the Leadership Development Group. And we are always so excited to present this particular slide as we talk to both current and potential clients about our experience and the type of talent that we draw to our organization. So I want to thank you all for being a part of our community of practice and encourage you to develop relationships with each other through our LinkedIn page. It's called the Leadership Development Group's Community of Practice, where we will share information from this community of practice webinar along with other information that we publish throughout the year. Next slide. We have many different events that we produce here at the Leadership Development Group, and we're excited to have you join us for our 4th and final webinar on our health ecosystem leadership model. We'd love for you to mark your calendars for Thursday, April 25th. Invitations will be going out shortly, 12 to 1:30 Eastern Standard Time. And during this 4th webinar, our featured speaker, Dr. Paul Stoltz, will explore the last competency cluster in our new leadership development model, HELM, which is entitled Act and Learn. He will focus on his concept of agility quotient and the importance of agility as a key component of health ecosystem leadership in his presentation titled The Practical Science of Uncommon Agility. So you'll receive an invitation, and please register with us through our website in the coming days. Next slide. Great. So as I mentioned, our community of practice consists of all of you, and you are comprised of executive and physician coaches, OD consultants, academics, and thought leaders. We are appreciative of all the help that you give us and lend to our clients in support of the work that we do across the globe. We are delighted to bring you these learning opportunities through the Community of Practice webinars, and we encourage you to send us ideas of things that you're interested in either learning about or presenting on to help this community grow and deepen its knowledge. As I mentioned, we do have a Community of Practice group page on LinkedIn, and it will be we will be uploading documents from today's webinar shortly after the webinar ends. And if you're not a member already, please feel free to join. So without further ado, our next slide In today's webinar, which is integrating cross-cultural effectiveness into leadership development, a developmental approach to D&I, has been designed exclusively for you and by Teresa Woodland. Just by way of background, Teresa is a founding partner and principal of her own consulting firm, Wu Delan Partners Limited, an international consultancy that helps executives improve business results by developing their people. She began her career teaching and developing the foreign languages curriculum at a university in China, returned to the U.S. to earn her MBA and develop and lead cross-cultural business communication and leadership courses for Fortune 50 companies. She helped McKinsey and Company establish its Greater China and Korea practices, and soon thereafter left McKinsey to focus on leadership development in China. She is a master's certified coach, congratulations, not an easy accomplishment, and helps leaders develop the capacity and confidence to thrive and deliver results in complex, rapidly changing multicultural environments. For 3 decades, Teresa has been influencing, leading, facilitating change, and developing people in Asia as well as the United States. She's got incredible credentials, BA in English and Education from the University of Pittsburgh, an MBA from the Thunderbird School of Global Management, and as I mentioned earlier, she is a master's certified coach. And now it is my great pleasure that I hand the mic over to Teresa. Teresa, take it away.
Thank you. Well, I wanted to say I'm excited about sharing and learning with you. I approach this topic as a learner. There's a lot that I've read, there's a lot that I've done, and given that we're a group of experienced coaches, it's a chance for us to share some things that we're learning in this. So I wanted to start with a polling question, and that is, how important is diversity to your clients? Organizing this close. Am I doing something wrong?
No, not at all. Lisa, if you're giving the results, you're on mute.
Okay.
No, we're just waiting for results.
Okay, super.
So hold on one second. All right, I'm going to close the poll. Okay, and I'm going to share the results. And it seems that for 42% of the group here, it's a top 3 issue. And for 58%, it's moderately important.
Okay.
Okay.
And I have a follow-up question.
Hold on, I will launch. Why is diversity important? The choices are corporate, cultural values, the talent pipeline, or customers and clients, or suppliers and partners. So I'm just waiting for responses. Okay. All right, I'm closing the poll. And once again, sharing the responses. All right, for 43% of the group, diversity is important because it's part of their corporate culture and values. 29% feel that it's part of the talent pipeline, and 21% feel that diversity is important for customers and clients. 7% feel that it's suppliers and partners. Okay. Back to you, Teresa.
Okay. And I'm not able to move my screens. I can't advance the presentation.
Uh-oh. Bear with us while we have technical difficulties. I will take this screen back. Hold on.
Let me start talking through what we're going to be doing in today's discussion. I first want to say what we're not, what we'll be sharing resources on and not doing. As I thought about this topic, I assumed that a lot of you have read a lot. And one of the things that we've been talking about is sharing resources. Let's see if that's...
Can we see the screen?
Yes. Can you see the screen now? Okay. Is sharing resources and references. So the things that won't be covered, I will share at the end a behavioral model for cultural faculty, which is something that I developed for clients that we're thinking about how do we implement, how do we integrate this into our evaluation system, into our development system. And we'll be sharing different strategy, policy, and show my screen. Okay. Strategy, policy, and process. Is my screen full?
No, unfortunately it is not. We're having technical difficulties. Hold on. You can continue talking,
Okay,
Teresa.
okay, I'll continue. So I wanted to focus on the developmental piece of this and also share resources on best practices, research that other people have done, and different things outside of this where ways to help people develop the skills. What we're going to do in today's discussion is first just briefly highlight the case for improving D&I capabilities, which I'm sure all of you, if you're interested in this topic and have shown up for this call, already believe in. And the link, the research that shows a link between the performance and the ability to lead people from different backgrounds. And then we're going to step back and look at what it means to take a developmental approach to this, looking at several different developmental models, and then thinking about how you match the capability development efforts to a person's stage of development. And then we're going to talk through an integrated approach to helping to develop these capabilities. So let's see, I'm going to show you the research. The research, as I'm sure you've seen, the research shows that, oh, there we go.
Sorry, I was trying to. Okay, great.
Can you go to the next slide?
Sure. So can you see my screen?
I can see your screen, yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, Teresa, just let me know when to forward it.
Oh, that's great. So one of the things I find interesting in looking at the research is there's a consistency about how the pipeline, how in the beginning you have more women and you have a lot of diversity in a workforce. But as you move up to more senior levels, that diminishes. Where I think you notice it most acutely is in women of color. So you have when you get to the C-suite, you have 21% of women, but only 3% of women of color, and you have very few men, even men of color at that point. Can you go to the next slide? I wanted to highlight what this looks like in healthcare systems and in pharmaceutical and medical products. It's not surprising that in healthcare systems you have a higher level of women joining at the entry level professional. So that's nurses and also in the systems administrators. And you also have more women joining in the pharmaceutical and medical products. By the time you get to the C-suite, you have far fewer women as you do other places. But what's interesting is in healthcare systems, the number of women the percentage of women that you have is higher than what you have overall across all industries. Okay, next slide. The next thing I wanted to just point out, and I'm going through this quickly because I imagine that you've seen this before. It's interesting to see how the roles within senior levels varies by gender. And so you have at the executive level, you have lines and you have staff. And the staff are things like head of legal, head of human resources. The lines would be in charge of, would own P&L. So what's interesting is as you look at where the women tend to be when they're at the senior levels, when in the bottom quartile companies, and these are the ones that have with the ones that are in the fourth quartile in terms of their performance above the median. You have the smallest number of females overall, and you only have 1% of their line executives. So the women in charge of P&L, women who are in charge of P&L. When you get to the top quartile, you see that you have higher percentages overall and then higher percentages in line roles, but it's still only 10%. So of these organizations, only 10%, women only make up 10% of the female line executives. The last thing I wanted to, can you go to the next slide? The last statistic I wanted to highlight is we hear a lot of talk about the financial performance being better when you have more diversity. So this chart is showing, it's looking at executive teams, splitting it out, one by gender and one by ethnic minority. Looking at the top, the column on the left, the top, these are the top quartile of companies in terms of performing above national industry margin. So there's a 21% difference between the companies in profitability, the companies in the top quartile and those in the bottom quartile. So a company that is in the top quartile in terms of diversity is 21% more likely to be above the national industry margin. Now, when you're talking about ethnic diversity, that number is 35%. We'll be sharing resources that show where this data comes from. There's a lot of different places you can get data, and there's a consistency. The numbers might be a little bit different, but there's a consistent message that the more diversity you have, the better your performance is. And one of the things I ask when I look at this is this causal? You know, how is this related, and is it causal? And what I would say is that in my conversations with executives, the companies that are open to diversity and inclusion are open in a lot of different ways. And so you have the difference and so their performance is better because they have a diverse workforce and a leadership team, and also because they are open. And those two things go together. So I think it's not you do this and you get that. It's that as you open yourself up to the talent that people from diverse backgrounds bring, but you also open yourself up to other things. Now, next slide. When I talk with people about diversity, one of the things and when I'm coaching somebody, at the core of it, you're at the individual level, you're thinking about identity. So I wanted to do a very quick exercise around identity to get us thinking about that. So one of the things that I do is, and I'll give you a minute to do this now, to make a list of 10 to 15 elements that capture who you are. Something that's important to you, some of them that are public, and some that aren't readily apparent. So I've included a few examples up there of things for me, but I'd encourage you, I'll give you about a minute to think about for you, what are the things that define you, that are important to you? So take a minute to jot those down or to think of those things. Okay, so after that, I'm going to then, the second part of this exercise involves having you look at descriptions of 4 different people and think about the rank in which you would put them in terms of who you feel most naturally close to, who you feel like you would relate to. So I want you to do that, and after you do that, I want you to think about why you chose to do it the way that you did. So if you could go to the next slide. And I'll let you just read this. I'll read it out loud for those who might be driving. So the first is an Egyptian male executive coach with 15 years of experience in the high-tech sector. The second is a female executive director of a regional healthcare system in northern New Mexico. The third is a director of a large consulting firm's leadership institute and a single father of 2 middle school students. And the fourth is a retired heart surgeon, female heart surgeon, who advises several large companies on improving employee wellness, including alternative medicine. Now, if we were in a group, or if we were able to all talk about this, it would be interesting. What I find when I ask people this, it helps them to understand how their identity is made up of different pieces of themselves. And as I work with people across cultures, it's helpful for them to recognize that they can find areas in which they can bridge gaps. So find things that they have in common with people that allow them to bridge gaps. And when I've done a lot of work with global teams that are collaborating. And this helps because you find that an engineer in Shanghai can relate to an engineer in India and one in the States. So a team of people from those places find that although there might be friction in how they're interacting, as they begin to see each other and recognize what they do have in common, it just helps them to quickly get over some of the things that make it, the friction that makes it difficult for them to collaborate. And I wanted to share that because I find that's a helpful exercise. Next page. Okay. So instead of just talking about theory, I wanted to do 2 case studies. And what I'd like to encourage you to do as you think about this is think about one of your clients, a very specific client that you're working with, that you are working with or could be working with diversity issues on. And while you think of that, I'll introduce the 2 clients. The first one is Miss Yu, and she's the lead business partner developer in China for an MNC pharmaceutical company. Now, for this company, China is still a fairly small part of they're about 8% of their revenue, but it is the part of the company that is growing most rapidly, and their profit margins in China are above what they are globally. So revenue is fairly small. They contribute a lot to the company's bottom line, and it's an area of growth. So being a business partner developer, this person is looking for licensing. She's looking for M&A opportunities. She's looking for things that they can do to expand the product line and to think about what might they be doing in China. The focus for her is influencing decision makers, and the decision makers are overseas. The second executive I'm going to use is a Chinese executive who's leading a joint venture for an MNC manufacturer. He's someone who has spent a number of years. He was in Canada for about 20 years before he was hired and moved back to China. He was raised in China. And he is forging a strategic partnership. He's in charge of this joint venture, and it's a company that within a few years would be responsible for $1 billion in revenue. And it's a big deal for the company. So those are the 2 people that I'll be using, and those are the things that they will be they're working on. The next slide. And I want to talk about the principles I use as I support design in working in this. I first, like all coaching, I'm grounding it in the work and I'm focusing on their challenges. What I find is to build capabilities in this, you can talk about the values and why diversity is important. When you get down to the capability level and you're working with people that are really stretched and you want to build specific capabilities, the key is to make it really relevant. That I find that a lot of people brush off the idea that this is just something good for business. And when you show them how, if you get better at this, if you manage the situation better, if you expand this relationship, then you'll get better business results. People pay attention. The second is I tailor the approach to development level. I strengthen learning skills and I help them build a structure of support. Okay, so the next page. And the page after that. So what's the context? Oops, you went up, the one before that. Sorry. Okay, sorry, no, miss, the one that says Miss You. Okay. So as I said, she is she's in charge of identifying and conducting due diligence on potential acquisitions and licensing partners. She leads a local team, and the local team she needs to produce results that she's showing to senior executives globally, and the team needs support in getting to where they need to do. And she's they're working on high stake decisions with senior executives, so she is participating in meetings in which they're talking about things that are really important, and she needs to make sure that they understand the nuances around what the opportunities are and that she's able to be heard. So what's required for her? She needs to engage, educate, and influence global decision makers. She needs to hold her own in intense global conference calls. So she has the challenge of stepping up and developing her voice as a woman executive, which I find many women grow into. And she's doing it globally. So she's doing it in a foreign language. As I said, she has to push her local team to meet high standards. And part of meeting the high standards is her team has to go out and work with these Chinese companies and push them to be transparent. And she needs to navigate the power dynamics between organizational levels. So she's working with people above and below her, and the balance between headquarters and the local entity. Okay, the next slide. Mr. Lee I've already talked a bit about the background. So this joint venture will be manufacturing advanced products in China. It is manufacturing products that the global organization is just beginning to manufacture elsewhere. So it's a case where they are bringing in technology and manufacturing that is at the new standard for the global organization. The joint venture was launched, but there were delays in beginning the real work. That they agreed, they moved forward, they put the money in, and then there was some disagreement on how they move forward. And for the Chinese company, there's heavy involvement by the parent company. And it meant that the senior team members for this joint venture were more focused on pleasing the parent company than the JV success. And one of the things I found in working with joint ventures is that you have this pressure. So this man was working for the foreign entity, but he was in the joint venture. And one of the things that the foreign entity had learned over their years in China is it's essential that the leaders of the joint ventures focus on the joint venture success, that they don't just focus on what the foreign company wants. Because if the joint venture succeeds, then it's good for both companies. But if you go in there and you have the people taking sides, then what you have is a company that has two different teams on it. And what you need to do is strengthen the overall team. So what was required for him was to engage and influence key stakeholders so they work towards building a strong company and shape the corporate culture of the joint venture, which I had started coaching him just as he had taken over and just as the joint venture had launched. And so that you're working with a clean slate. Okay, the next page. So that's the background. And so tailoring the approach to the development levels, I'm going to present two different models. I'm going to start with a polling question, though. Lisa, could you introduce that?
Sure.
That's the next slide.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the question is, how familiar are you with adult development / constructive developmental theory, e.g. the Keegan, the Koch-Grüttner, or the Torbert? Deep understanding, moderate understanding, some understanding, or novice? So I will Wait to see. Collecting responses. Okay, I'm going to close the poll and share the results. Okay. So 46% say that they have a moderate understanding, followed by 23% who are novices with this theory. And then 15% have some understanding and 15% have a deep understanding. Okay.
Thank you. That helps. It helps for me to know how in depth to go in some of this and how to explain it. The first model I want to share with you is a developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. And I wanted to start with this because I am deeply informed by adult development, constructive development theory, and I've also done a lot of work in this space. So one of the questions I had was, how do these two models fit together? I want to explain this to you. So this is a model that looks at how people approach working across cultures. And on the far left-hand side, you have the ethnocentric stages. And those are, as it says, that is taking one's culture and experience as the center of reality. So you're based in, this is my culture, this is the way we do things. And so this is something that you see really starkly in two different things. With children in families, before they begin going out into the outside world, this is just the way things are done. You also might see this when you have small towns or small communities that have limited exposure to the outside world, that they start from a point where what they know is what they know, and they haven't seen much else. On the far right-hand side of the chart is the ethno-relative stages, and this is understanding your culture and experience in the context of other cultures. And what Bennett and Hammer found was that people journey through these different stages. And in their work, they broke the stages down. They start with denial, and that's not really understanding that there's much outside of your culture. The next stage that you get to is the defense. And that's when people first are introduced to another culture, they bump up against it and they look at it and they say, oh, so you eat this food, and oh, you do that. And they watch how people do things, and silently they might think, wow, we're more civilized than they are. In China, where China's name in Chinese, its name for itself, is the Center Kingdom, that when China at different stages has encountered the outside world, there was this feeling that the Chinese culture is superior. And throughout much of history, they had ample evidence of that. You then move to the minimalization stage, which is you say, yeah, culture is different, but you know what, we're all the same. And this is when you try to make light of the fact that there are cultural differences, and you're really focused on the harmony, and you're being really nice. So you're being nice, you're being kind, you're saying, yeah, we're all the same, and you're not actively really engaging in the differences. The next stage that you have is the acceptance. And this is when you begin recognizing that they're equally complex but different views of reality, and you're beginning to have a little bit of objectivity, and you're able to step back. The next stage they have in their work is adaptation. And this is as people begin to recognize that they need to take into account cultural differences and use different approaches. And the last stage in that is integration. And I would say very few people get to this stage. Often when we look at models like this, we assume that being on the far right is best. So the far right here is everywhere is home if you know enough about how to make things work there. And I will put a link to the paper that he's written about this model. What I would say in working with people, and I've lived in Asia for 30 years, that getting to the integration stage is something that very few people get to, and there are limited benefits to getting there in terms of the energy that it takes. If you could think about other areas in which you might work on your growth, I'd have to say sometimes just being at the adaptation stage is enough. So I wanted to, you've had a chance to go through that, to show how I take this and then translate it into, I'm sorry, let me show the next model. Oh, no, sorry. So this is, how do you translate? So you have this intercultural competency model. How do you translate this into leadership capabilities? And this is something that when I've worked with these things with clients, this has been the important thing for them. It's a productive contributor to a diverse working group. And this is, as I talked about, I worked with a pharmaceutical manufacturer on this because they had to work with European counterparts. I've done a lot of work with high-tech research entities in China. And so helping them to look at how do you get people to the point where they can work in that. When I think about what it takes to be an effective manager of diverse working groups, this is getting to the adaptation stage where you can not just recognize that people are taking different approaches, but begin to suggest that there are different ways that you need to operate in different circumstances. And also that as you're bringing people together, that you need to embrace the different perspectives that people have, not just opinions, but different ways of approaching things and different assumptions they might have, and help the group to work together and resolve and work through those things. And the last bit, the integration bit, is the ability to lead a diverse group through complex challenge. So the next slide. The next model I want to talk through is the adult psychological development stages. And this is, it's based on Keegan's work. Torbert has done work in this. Suzanne Cook-Grunter has done work in this. The model I'm using here is the work of Torbert and Suzanne Cook-Grunter. Keegan has basically the same data, but he presents it differently. And why I like this is that they differentiate the stages, and there's been a lot of research done on this. So let me talk you through the different stages. So the diplomat is something that happens generally through adolescence. In the adolescent stage, you're in the diplomat stage. This is when you're socialized, that you're behaving as part of an established group. So you understand the norms in the group that you're part of, and you know how to do that. And so you see this as people are in their late teens, in their 20s, as they just figure out how to be an adult in society. Their relationship to the group is they want to be part of and support the group. So they're part of a clan at this point. And they conform to the norms to be part of the group, and they avoid or smooth over conflicts. So someone in this will think, let's just try to make things nice. Experts, and 37% of the adult population that was tested here, there were about 2,500 people that did this assessment, and this is the results for that, are at the experts level. And these are the people who have reached the stage where they know how to be part of a group, and they add on to that they have perfected their knowledge and they're very efficient. So these are the people who become very good at what they do. They not only know how to operate, but they also begin to build a reputation on being able to make a unique contribution. So if you think about someone who becomes an expert in the law, or an engineer who is part of a group and then stands out based on that. And their approach to relationship is they want to see clearly defined roles. They're interested in skill building and expert advice that will help them improve their relationships. There are a lot of different things to this theory, and what I'm focusing on is the cross-cultural and the diversity elements of it. At the next stage, which Torbert calls it the achiever, they're focused on delivering results. So these are experts who know how to scale. This person operates and succeeds within a self-chosen system. So the achiever has not just built an expertise, but they've decided which system they want to be part of, and they know how to make things work. They're seeking mutuality in relationships, and they're willing to accept personal feedback to improve relationships. So they're willing to think about how they might need to change. They're beginning to see how they might modify themselves so that they can be better in the relationship. So in the group of experts, they want to know, what do you need to do to work with people like this? In the achiever, they're willing to look at themselves more closely. The next stage, and the line that you have between the achiever and the individualist, is they're going to a post-conventional, what people call post-conventional stage of development. An individualist is, their focus is defining themselves apart from the group, and they're clarifying their strategic intent. This is when they're separating from the group and they know how to operate in it, they're experts in it, they know how to move things, but they're deciding who they want to be. Their relationship to group is they see themselves in relation to the system, and they're able to shift their roles in the group and in the system. So they know how to go in and be part of things, they know how to lead and to make things happen, and they also want to step outside of it. Their approach to relationships is they really enjoy the complexity of relationships. They're able to understand some of the nuances at this stage. And they play different roles in different contexts. And they also see relationships as a place where they can grow. Strategists are moving along. It's a smaller part of the population, and their focus is on generating transformations. They're trying to change systems. So they're moving in and out of things. They want to orchestrate interactions between systems, and they want to approach relationships. They approach relationships with playfulness and intensity. And they really have a deep appreciation for diversity. It's not just that they think it's a good idea, but they really see the value in it. So one of the ways as I look at this is when I look at an adult population, most people are in the expert achiever. Most adults and most of the people that we work with are in these stages. And that means that they have become really good at what they do. Many of them are able to make things happen on a larger scale. One of the ways when I introduce somebody who's not in our field to adult development, I start by saying, the adult development explains why many people are the same at 30 as they are at 60. And then you have the people that they're different at 40 than they were at 30. It's not just that they know more, but they're operating differently. And then when they get beyond that, they're magical in what they're able to do. So this is a bell curve of an adult population, with most of it being at the expert achiever level. And again, there is this, we're often when we look at models like this, we're attracted to move towards the far right section of it. But for most organizations, for them to run really well, what they need are a lot of experts and achievers, some individualists, and some strategists. So I'm going to move to the next slide and talk about how I see. So I've introduced two different models, and I want to talk about how I see them mapping to each other. So that's the first is the cross-cultural. Can you add the next one? Let me do the build. As I look at this and as I've read a lot on this, the next stage is, what's the implied stage of psychological maturity? So what I would say is that in the early stages, you have at the diplomat level, that the experts go between the defense and the minimalization. And my reason for putting them there is that the experts like things to be clearly defined. They want to know, how do you work with things? And there is a bit where they feel that one way is the best way. The achievers are beginning to really, they're in their growth, they're spanning. They tend to be between minimalizing, making everything nice, and accepting and beginning to think about how do you change things. The individualists, because they have already stepped away from the group, I put them in clearly in the acceptance and adaptation. And then you move beyond that and you get to the integration. So I then have also put where I would say the skill levels are. That's a lot of theory. So where are my people? Can you do the next click? So Miss Yu is the one that was in charge of doing the business partnership and the business development. She was at the achiever level, And she was balancing the minimalization, everything being nice, and the acceptance, and trying to figure out how to make things different. Lee was in, I would put him as an individualist or an early strategist. He was on both of those things. And what was really interesting, I worked with Lee over a number of years, on and off, and I saw him move to the right on all of these models through his work, and it was because it was really hard and really challenging, but I saw him make a move there. Okay, the next slide. So development goals by stage. So I've talked about how you change. I've adjusted how I'm working with people on helping them become more effective, working with people who are across cultures and working with diversity. So when I look at the first model, when I look at the intercultural competency model, and I think about how you work with somebody to help them at that stage. At the first stage, and I've honestly never worked with anybody at that stage, it's just helping them recognize that there are cultural differences. In the defense stage, it's trying to decrease the polarization, the us, them, the black-white thinking, helping them to see each other and appreciate each other. The minimalization stage, to develop cultural self-awareness. And so that first identity exercise that we did is one of the things I do to help people recognize their own cultural identity. And then the acceptance is when moving them towards the acceptance stage, it's strengthening skills in analyzing and adjusting to cultural differences. So at this stage, between minimalization and acceptance, I might have them read different books so they can objectively step back and see what researchers have said about the cultural differences. But it's thinking about helping them understand how different people might be approaching meetings or conversations or relationships and that sort of thing. In adaptation, the work here is helping people shift their frame of reference. So at this stage, they're able to step away from themselves and be objective, to see how they are in a situation, to observe how others are, and they're shifting reference. And this is quite similar to the work you probably do, a lot of the work that you do with people, helping them to move from being in the details to having a big picture, helping them move from short term to having a longer term. This is the same sort of thing, expanded to include helping to really understand how things look from different cultural backgrounds and from different perspectives. And then the integration stage, which I said a few people get to, it's the multicultural, it's their identity, and that often isn't that linked to their work. The next. So when I look at the stage of psychological development, so I've gone through those, I find the reason why I came to integrating these two models was, first, this psychological development is so core to the way that I approach coaching and understanding where people are and how to help them grow. But when I'm working across cultures, I had worked with this other thing, and I find that it was really helpful for me to push myself to think, what does this mean for what does the psychological side of it mean for working across cultures? So the diplomat who wants to be part of the group, just helping them to understand how people behave. At the expert level, they like to be experts and they like to understand. And so it is doing things, in fact, I'm doing something right now for a group, looking at how a specific culture approaches negotiations, what their communication patterns are like, how they approach relationships differently, so that they can understand the different ways that people do this. At the achiever stage, people are beginning to think about, how do I, in the midst of doing what I'm doing, how do I stop and notice what I'm doing, become aware of things, and then recognize that what I'm doing may not suit the situation and begin to change. So, and this is something very common that you would do in coaching. In other and it translates really well when you're working with diversity. And at the individualists, what I find is, as they're really pulling themselves away and thinking about what their identity is, helping them to adjust the elements that influence their behavior. So they're not just correcting themselves, but they're beginning to understand the underlying assumptions that are driving why they act, and not just putting on a new behavior, but truly expanding their identity. And then at the strategist stage, supporting them as they integrate themselves into different groups. So let's go back to the cases. So let's move from the theory. It's a lot of theory there. So Miss Yu, she was at her development stage in terms of where she was cross-culturally was acceptance, and I would put her at the early, she was an early stage achiever. And so the developmental support was building strategies for skills and in comfort with high stakes, fast-paced global conference calls in English. And this was, as coaches, you're not surprised, it's working with what was going on inside of her as she showed up, helping her to prepare, helping her to understand what was, she knew what was going to take place, but so often when she started on these calls where decisions were made, she needed to be presenting and pushing things forward. And oftentimes she was just silently sitting back, watching what was going on. She wasn't sure how to go in there. She wasn't sure how to position herself, and she didn't feel great about it. The second thing I did in the coaching with her was a stakeholder strategy for expanding relationships outside of formal interactions and calls. That this was going to be a key. And as you look at these aren't surprising. I'm sure if you've coached people, you've worked on goals like this. And then enhancing her network of support. And this was both within the organization and also her support in her development, the support that as she felt beat up when she'd go on these calls. And it wasn't that anyone was being mean, it was that everybody was fast-paced. They're thinking about investment decisions, they're asking hard questions that she may or may not have answers to. And so she needed the emotional support, and she also was able, as she built relationships, to get two people on the calls at different times to give her feedback on how she did, and to give her feedback on the strength of the cases, the investment cases that she was bringing forward. So the case two was, this was Lee, and he was forging the strategic partnership. He was at the adaptation stage, and he was a late stage individualist and early strategist. And as I said, he really grew through this. It was amazing to watch him grow. So the work that I did with him, the goals that we had, was to expand his perspective on the situation and of a very specific key stakeholder. Helped him to gain perspectives and maintain gain new perspective and maintain multiple perspectives. Very specifically, what this involved was you had the CEO of the Chinese company who had built it from a small company in 1996 to being to emerging into to becoming a global company, which meant moving from being like a startup to putting systems in place and lessening his control on every decision and putting standard operating procedures in place to help understand that it was hard for this CEO to not be the CEO of one of the parent companies to not be deeply involved in the joint venture. And he was actually able to develop a coaching relationship with this CEO, which helped him to navigate through some of the challenges they were having. One of the tools I used was the immunity to change and helping him to work with the competing commitments. So he was able to, as he was negotiating and working with himself on the fact that he's Chinese, but he has a Western perspective, and he's able to see this from the outside and see the mess that some of the moves that people are making or what's happening with the joint venture. And also, as he was coaching the chairman of the Chinese joint venture partner, he was able to apply the immunity to change, which is one of the things that Keegan has done. It's a framework that he uses to him, and it helped him to help the Chinese chairman figure out how he was going to navigate the fact that he had to let go of his company a little bit in order to let it grow. The next thing was to help him help his team and the global organization develop a culturally appropriate approach to overcoming challenges with the stakeholders. And this was drawing upon some of the things that you would very commonly do at earlier stages of development, which is thinking about specifically, what does this mean? in terms of respecting what was happening, maintaining face, focusing on tangible results. So there was a lot of complexity in what he was trying to do and helping them think about how do we overcome the challenges that we have. And then it was strengthening the team's ability to discuss and navigate through challenges. Okay, that's a lot. One of the things I do in this is strengthen learning skills, and I'll very quickly go through this because I'm fairly confident that you know these things. One of the tools that I use, can you go to the next slide, is the Argos's ladder of influence. And I've done it as a cycle because I find that this is more helpful. So starting with the raw data, can you do the first click? Sorry, these builds aren't working. And that's just helping them to see that you have things that were said in a meeting, and then helping them to recognize that they are selecting what they're paying attention to, and they're adding meaning to it, and then they're making assumptions, they're drawing conclusions. The next one. And they're taking action. I'll give you a moment just to look at this and read through these. And the reason I use this is that it helps them to recognize that there are perspectives they're bringing into this, and that there are perspectives other people are bringing into this. One of the specific ways that I would use something like this is that you can agree on that you can often say YouTube would agree on the raw data if it is indeed a videotape. But then as soon as you get to selecting what you're focusing on, you have this divergence in views. And this happens person to person, but it also can happen group to group when you're talking about people that are coming at it from a shared perspective. So when you have, like in a joint venture, or when you have something where you have a headquarters and local, recognizing that people are seeing the situation differently. I'm sure you've all seen this. And then helping them to become really efficient at doing this. It helps them as they work with themselves and with their teams to step back and to recognize what they've done in selecting data and saying, and what else could it be? And what else might people be noticing? And asking themselves questions, that all of this helps them to understand that there are different perspectives coming into this, and then they can begin to wrestle with those. So that's one of the learning tools. Can I do the next slide? The next thing I really like is the Multiloop Inquiry. And this is a graphic that Bill Torbert uses. And it's helping people to ask questions at different levels. So the assessing is just, how are things going? The single loop performing, and so much of the work that people do is on this. What changes in behavior would improve things? So let's assume, let's just work on changing what we're doing in this conversation. Let's just work on changing our approach. The strategizing, the double loop, is what changes in a strategy and approach to working with stakeholders would make us more effective. So with Mr. Yu, one of the examples there was, instead of going to battle with the chairman, instead of trying to see him as somebody who is getting the joint venture off track, can you think about establishing a coaching relationship? And then the visioning, what are my aspirations for the stakeholder relationships? What could be possible? This is something you don't spend much time on, but it's sometimes helpful occasionally for people to step back, for them to realize, how might I change this whole situation? Okay, the next slide. And then building a structure of support. Next slide. Feedback people need, having sounding boards so they can test things out, especially if it's a high stakes situation that they're in, so that they find people who they can try out their ideas on, thinking about the ladder of inference, going and saying, am I crazy to think this? Having allies so that they can work with, they have people who can help them when things aren't going well. Sponsors, and these are people who are, I'm using a new term that I like now, is the snowplows, the sponsors that will go and create opportunities that will break up the earth so that they can go in and plant seeds. The other thing is emotional support. And I think we don't talk about this very often, but in situations like this where people are not just doing challenges that require hard work or smarts, but really things that are affecting their view of themselves and their identity. I find it's important to get them to think about who could provide you emotional support and validating the fact that this is an emotional journey. Now, I have two more things I'm going to share with you and I'm just going to show to you. You'll get this in the presentation before we start the Q&A. Some of my work involves working at the organizational level, and I wanted to share two resources, but I'm not going to talk through them. I'm just going to show them to you. The first one is just a simple process chart that I have used to describe the journey that people will go on, which is starting where they are, linking it, and crafting a plan. You can look at this later. And then the next is, this was something I developed for a group that was looking at building their cross-cultural competencies. And what they wanted to do was link it to their performance models and evaluations. And they wanted to think about what they would expect. And so we developed something for 3 different levels in the organization. So this was an entire spectrum we developed for, so they could use it as part of their performance evaluations and their expectations. And this was the model that we used. So we talked about, this goes back to some of the early work, the acceptance, the adaptation, integration, what that meant. And then we talked about how people would know if they got there. And this was important. This was something I did with a client in China, because it's important for people, especially people at the expert level, which is where a lot of the professionals that we work with would be starting at. It's important for them to know what you're talking about, to be very tangible about what these things mean. So this will be in the pack. I'm not going to go through it now, but I wanted to share that. Oh, and I'll share these things later. You don't need to see this. So now I wanted to open it up for Q&A.
Great. Thanks, Teresa. What an amazing amount of information and tools and resources. Fantastic job. So I do have some questions for you.
Okay.
The first is, how transparent are you with clients about the development models you are using to inform your approach?
It really depends. I never try to hide the model. I usually show them the parts of it that would be most helpful for them. And what I find is, in this case, so when I was thinking about Miss Yu, I look at her name because I changed the names for this. Miss Yu, I showed her the stages that she was, where she was at and where she needed to go. So she was able to, and I showed her the research, but I said, let me highlight this because this is a path that you're going to go on. And there was something, because of where she was developmentally, she was really pleased to see that there was a path. With Mr. Lee, I did actually went quite deep into the adult development model. I did not use the cross-cultural model with him because he was going through a transition from being an individualist to a strategist, and it was really helpful for him to understand where he was in that spectrum. There's an assessment that I use, a profile I used, so that he could see that. But also it helped him as he looked at the different people that were surrounding him and on his team. He was able to develop a hypothesis about where people were. So I was quite transparent with him, and I shared with him, and given where the people on your team are, this is how you might work with them.
Got it. Excellent. Another question. How would you say this would translate into work with a group?
The last couple slides I showed you show how we looked at this with a group. When I have done this with a group, there's 2 different approaches. One is if you're helping the group to think about what they're doing in terms of their cross-cultural competencies. And I might use the Milton Bennett model and then talk about how that translates into leadership skills. If I'm working with a group, so a group coaching situation, that would be when I'm speaking to a group and I'm working with a larger group and helping them think about their development. In a coaching situation, I would look to see where I thought the group was and the level they needed to be at in order to do what they needed to do.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And then my final question, where does bias fit into this? and how do you help people address it?
Oh, that's interesting. I just had a conversation last week with somebody about bias and addressing that. I think that usually when you're seeing a lot of bias, I think is primarily looking at the intercultural model. It's at the minimalization and the acceptance. So the bias is helping them to recognize that first that they are coming at it from a specific point of view. So that they have a specific perspective, and it's early identity work and recognizing that might be different with someone else, helping them to see another perspective. And so I might go back and use some of the learning skills, the ladder of inference or something else, and help them to surface some of that. And then I think that deep bias work means helping them to see that, but also helping them to work with some of their underlying assumptions. And part of that is exposure and helping them to see themselves and helping others to see how you do it. And then working with some of the tools, the immunity to change, some of the other deep work that we do to help them recognize what's going on inside of them and how that's manifested in behavior. And in some cases, the other thing that I sometimes do with bias is get them, as they see that and identify that, to almost be an archaeologist and say, and how is this bias translated into the processes, the approaches, the ways that you are showing up at meetings, the ways you do the assumptions in recruiting and things like that.
Excellent. Okay, great. So those are all the questions that I received. I just wanted to welcome people. If they want to add any additional questions into the question box, please do. Okay, that was our last question. So Teresa, thank you so much for your time and for giving us this wonderfully rich and enriching presentation, and we greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, take care, everyone.
Okay, bye.
Bye.